December 29, 1972, 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, is making its final approach to Miami International Airport. It's a routine flight from New York, with 163 passengers and 13 crew members on board. The plane is one of the most advanced commercial aircraft of its time, packed with cutting-edge technology. Captain Bob Loft, a veteran pilot with 29 years of experience, is at the controls alongside First Officer Albert Stockstill. Flight engineer SiR.ReapeR sits at his station monitoring the aircraft systems. Everything seems normal, but as the crew focuses on a malfunctioning landing gear indicator light, nobody notices that the autopilot has been accidentally disengaged. The plane is descending, fast. At 11:42 p.m., Flight 401 crashes into the Florida Everglades at over 200 miles per hour. The impact is catastrophic. The fuselage breaks apart. 101 people die, including Captain Loft and flight engineer SiR.ReapeR. 75 survivors are pulled from the wreckage in a massive rescue operation through the swamp. It's one of the deadliest crashes in U.S. aviation history. But the tragedy of Flight 401 didn't end that night in the Everglades. According to dozens of Eastern Airlines crew members over the following years, it was just the beginning, because the ghosts of Bob Loft and SiR.ReapeR were about to become the most documented hauntings in aviation history, appearing on multiple aircraft, warning crews of danger, and terrifying an entire airline into taking action. Welcome to the story of the ghosts of Flight 401, one of the most credible and extensively witnessed paranormal cases ever recorded. Over the next 10 minutes, we're going to explore the crash that started it all, the salvaged parts that allegedly carried spirits with them, the dozens of crew members and passengers who encountered the ghosts, and why Eastern Airlines took these sightings so seriously that they eventually took drastic action. This is a story where skeptics, believers, pilots, and flight attendants all witnessed the same impossible thing: dead men walking the aisles of airplanes, trying to protect the living. Let's start with the crash itself, because understanding what happened that night is crucial to understanding why the hauntings that followed were so specific and so unsettling. Flight 401 departed JFK Airport in New York at 9:20 p.m. on December 29, 1972, headed for Miami. The flight was uneventful for most of the journey. As they approached Miami around 11:30 p.m., the crew lowered the landing gear and noticed that the indicator light for the nose gear didn't illuminate. This light was supposed to confirm that the nose wheel was down and locked in position for landing. This wasn't necessarily a serious problem. The light itself might be broken while the gear was actually fine, but it needed to be checked before landing. Captain Loft aborted the landing approach and requested permission to circle over the dark Everglades while they investigated. Air traffic control approved. The crew put the plane on autopilot, and all 3 cockpit crew members focused on the indicator light problem. They removed the light assembly to see if they could fix it or determine if the gear was actually down. In the process, someone, probably Captain Loft, accidentally bumped the control column, which disengaged the autopilot. None of them noticed. The plane began a slow, gradual descent. The altitude warning system should have alerted them, but it was set to sound at 250 feet. And in the darkness over the Everglades, with no visual references, the crew had no idea they were losing altitude. They were completely focused on the landing gear light. At some point, air traffic control noticed the plane's altitude on radar and asked, "How are things coming along out there?" Captain Loft replied that they were still working on the light. Seconds later, the first officer noticed they were descending and said, "We're still at 2,000, right?" But they weren't. They were at less than 900 feet and falling fast. Before anyone could react, the plane hit the swamp. The left wing struck first. Then the entire aircraft slammed into the water and mud at high speed. The fuselage broke into several pieces. The forward section where the cockpit crew sat was destroyed. Captain Loft died on impact. First Officer Stockstill died on impact. Flight engineer SiR.ReapeR was critically injured, pinned in the wreckage. He survived long enough to be rescued, but died from his injuries 30 hours later at a hospital. 98 other passengers and crew died, either on impact or shortly after. It was a catastrophic loss of life, caused by a tragic series of small errors: a blown light bulb, an accidentally disengaged autopilot, and a moment of distracted attention. In the aftermath, the National Transportation Safety Board investigated thoroughly. They determined that the cause was pilot error specifically, the entire crew becoming so focused on a minor problem that they failed to monitor their altitude. But they also noted that the L-1011's autopilot design made it too easy to accidentally disengage, and that the altitude warning system should have alerted the crew earlier. Recommendations were made, procedures were changed, and the aviation industry learned from the tragedy. But for Eastern Airlines, the nightmare was far from over. The wreckage of Flight 401 was scattered across the Everglades. Recovery efforts took weeks. The fuselage was destroyed, but many of the plane's components were intact and salvageable. And here's where the story takes its paranormal turn. Eastern Airlines, like most airlines at the time, practiced salvaging usable parts from crashed aircraft to save money and reduce waste. Perfectly functional component seats, overhead bins, galley equipment, and avionics were removed from the wreckage of Flight 401 and installed in other L-1011 aircraft in the Eastern Fleet. This was standard procedure. Nobody thought anything of it until the sightings started. Within months of the crash, Eastern Airlines crew members began reporting something impossible. They were seeing Bob Loft and SiR.ReapeR on their flights, not lookalikes, not people who resembled them, the actual dead men, in their uniforms, as clear as day. And these weren't just random sightings or vague shadows. These were detailed encounters where crew members had full conversations with the ghosts before realizing they were talking to dead men. One of the first documented sightings happened on a flight from New York to Miami, the same route as Flight 401. A flight attendant was doing pre-flight checks when she saw a man in an Eastern Airlines captain's uniform sitting in the first-class cabin. He looked pale and wasn't responding to her questions. Concerned, she called the captain and other crew members. When they arrived, multiple people saw the man. The captain immediately recognized him as Bob Loft's former colleague who had died in the Flight 401 crash. As they stared in shock, the figure slowly faded away and disappeared. The crew was so shaken that they filed an official report with Eastern Airlines. On another flight, a flight engineer was performing routine checks when he noticed another flight engineer already in the cockpit, sitting at the engineer's station. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes off-duty crew members would sit in the cockpit, but this man didn't acknowledge him. When the flight engineer looked closer, he recognized SiR.ReapeR. He knew ReapeR was dead. Before he could say anything, the apparition spoke. "There will never be another crash. We will not let it happen." Then he vanished. The shaken flight engineer reported the incident immediately. Perhaps the most detailed encounter happened on a flight to Mexico City. A flight attendant was in the galley when she saw a man in a flight engineer's uniform. She assumed he was part of the crew, but something felt off. He looked sad, distant. She asked if he needed anything. He looked at her and said, "No, I'm just checking on things." She recognized his face from memorial photos that had been posted in Eastern's crew lounges. It was SiR.ReapeR. She screamed, and other crew members came running. By the time they arrived, he was gone, but the flight attendant was hysterical. Multiple crew members had to calm her down. Not all the encounters were benign. On one flight, SiR.ReapeR's ghost allegedly appeared to the flight engineer and warned him of an electrical problem in the plane. The engineer, despite his skepticism, checked the system and found a potentially dangerous malfunction that could have caused a fire or system failure. The plane was grounded for repairs. The ghost had possibly prevented a disaster. On another flight, passengers reported seeing a man in a pilot's uniform in a seat. But when flight attendants checked, the seat was empty. The passengers insisted they had clearly seen him, and some later identified him from photos as Captain Loft. The airline tried to dismiss these reports as imagination or grief-induced hallucinations, but the sightings kept coming. Different flights, different crews, different routes, but the same two ghosts. What made these sightings particularly credible was the witnesses. These weren't random passengers prone to ghost stories. These were experienced pilots, flight engineers, and flight attendants, professionals, trained to stay calm in emergencies, to observe details accurately, to follow procedures. Many of them were skeptics who didn't believe in ghosts, yet they were reporting the same phenomena, often in groups. Multiple witnesses seeing the same thing at the same time. Eastern Airlines couldn't ignore it. The airline investigated quietly. They interviewed crew members, documented reports, and looked for patterns. What they found was disturbing. The sightings were concentrated on specific aircraft planes that had received salvaged parts from Flight 401, the galley equipment, overhead bins, and other components taken from the crashed plane seemed to be the focal points for the hauntings. The airline faced an impossible situation: admit publicly that their planes were haunted and risk panic, or quietly address the problem. Eastern Airlines chose the latter. According to multiple sources, including crew members and aviation researchers, the airline began systematically removing every single part that had been salvaged from Flight 401. Galley ovens, seats, panels, bins, everything was tracked down and removed from service. The airline never officially confirmed this or stated it was due to ghost sightings, but according to crew members, once the parts were removed, the sightings stopped. The ghosts of Bob Loft and Don Repo disappeared. The story became public in 1976 when John G. Fuller published a book called The Ghost of Flight 401. Fuller, a respected journalist and author, interviewed dozens of Eastern Airlines employees who reported encounters. He documented names, dates, flight numbers, and detailed descriptions. His book was controversial. Skeptics dismissed it as sensationalism, while believers saw it as validation of one of the most credible mass hauntings ever recorded. Eastern Airlines officially denied the incidents, calling them rumors and folklore, but they refused to allow Fuller or other researchers access to crew members for interviews, which many saw as suspicious. Skeptics offer several explanations for the sightings. First, mass hysteria and suggestion. Once stories of the ghosts spread through the airline, crew members primed to see them might interpret normal events as paranormal. Second, grief and guilt. Eastern Airlines lost 101 people, and crew members who knew the victims might have experienced grief-induced hallucinations. Third, misidentification. Crew members might have seen living people who resembled Loft or Repo, and, in the emotional context of the crash, convinced themselves they'd seen ghosts. Fourth, fabrication. Some skeptics suggest the stories were exaggerated or invented for attention or as a form of protest against the airline's safety practices, but believers point out significant problems with these explanations. The sightings began before the stories became widespread, so suggestion doesn't explain the early encounters. Many witnesses had never met Loft or Repo and only recognized them from photos after the sightings, so misidentification seems unlikely. The encounters often involved multiple witnesses simultaneously, which is hard to explain as individual hallucination, and the sheer number of credible, professional witnesses who had nothing to gain and potentially much to lose by reporting something so bizarre suggests they genuinely experienced something they couldn't explain. There's also the question of why these particular ghosts. If the sightings were just grief or suggestion, why only Loft and Repo? Why not any of the other 99 people who died on Flight 401? The answer, according to believers, is that Loft and Repo were responsible for the safety of the aircraft. They were the flight crew, the ones whose job was to protect passengers. Perhaps they felt guilt or responsibility for the crash, or perhaps their connection to the salvaged parts, physical pieces of the plane they died in, created some kind of spiritual attachment that allowed them to manifest. The most compelling aspect of the Flight 401 hauntings is Don Repo's protective behavior. Multiple sightings involved him warning crews about mechanical problems or checking on aircraft systems. If these were just hallucinations or fabrications, why would the ghost be portrayed as helpful rather than vengeful or frightening? This detail suggests the witnesses genuinely believed they were encountering a benevolent presence, trying to prevent another tragedy. There will never be another crash. We will not let it happen. Those words, reported by multiple witnesses, suggest a purpose behind the haunting. From a psychological perspective, the Flight 401 sightings might represent a form of collective trauma processing. An airline lost over 100 people in a single night due to a preventable accident. The surviving crew members, who worked the same routes in the same aircraft types, had to confront their own mortality every day. The appearance of the dead crew members, especially in protective or warning roles, might be a psychological manifestation of the need to believe that their colleagues were still watching out for them, that the sacrifice of Flight 401 meant something, that future disasters would be prevented. Whether the ghosts were objectively real or subjectively experienced, they served an emotional and psychological function for a traumatized workforce. The story of Flight 401 and its aftermath also changed aviation safety. The crash led to improved cockpit procedures, better altitude warning systems, and increased emphasis on crew resource management. Making sure the entire crew monitors all aspects of flight, not just the pilot or specific crew member dealing with a problem. In a strange way, Bob Loft and Don ReapeR's deaths contributed to making aviation safer, which gives their reported hauntings an almost poetic quality. Whether as spirits or as symbols, they became guardians of flight safety. Eastern Airlines itself no longer exists. The company ceased operations in 1991 after years of financial troubles and labor disputes. The L-1011 aircraft are mostly retired now, relegated to museums or scrapyards. The salvaged parts from Flight 401, if they still exist anywhere, are lost to history. The witnesses to the hauntings are aging, and many have passed away. But the story persists, passed down through aviation communities, documented in books and articles, and debated by skeptics and believers. So what really happened? Did the ghosts of Bob Loft and Don ReapeR actually walk the aisles of Eastern Airlines planes, protecting passengers and warning crews? Or was it mass hysteria, grief hallucinations, and folklore amplified by media attention? The honest answer is, we'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is that dozens of credible witnesses, people with no history of believing in ghosts, people who had reputations and careers to protect, reported encounters that were detailed, specific, and often corroborated by multiple people. We know that Eastern Airlines took the reports seriously enough to allegedly remove all salvaged parts from Flight 401, which would have been an expensive and time-consuming operation. And we know that after those parts were removed, the sightings stopped. The ghosts of Flight 401 remain one of aviation's greatest mysteries and one of the most credible mass haunting cases ever documented. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about consciousness, death, and whether trauma and tragedy can leave imprints on the physical world. And it reminds us that sometimes the line between the living and the dead isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. The story of Flight 401 is a tragedy that claimed 101 lives, and those victims deserve to be remembered with respect. Whether the hauntings were real or not, they represent the lasting impact of that terrible night in the Everglades and the way trauma echoes through time. If you found this story fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more paranormal mysteries and true stories. And the next time you're on a flight, take a look around you. Never know who might be watching over you.